Hello, and welcome to Off the Grind Book Club. If you're too burned out to deal with your burnout,
You are in the right place. Hello, Sarah. How are you?
I'm good, Mari. How are
I'm
you?
good. I'm good. So I was thinking about last time when we were talking to Justine Maston, we kind of ended by kind of sharing with each other what we were going to do and have been doing for our own well-being and all of that. And
Mhm.
you, I believe, were talking about enjoying time by the pool with your
Yes.
daughter's swim competition. How's that been?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. Um, I'm noticing today's Friday, so I get to do swimming tonight. So I have my little mug here that says drinking coffee is my behavioral adaptation to being in a dorsal vagal autonomic nervous system state.
Oh,
So
man.
Friday morning, right, for any polyvagal nerds out there might understand kind of the depletion that's coming. But I get to go to the pool tonight and it gets to be a chance. I'm reading a really good book. So I'm looking forward to doing that. And another beautiful thing is now that my kiddos swimming more often, we're building this beautiful community. And so lots of other parents and caregivers are running carpool. And so it's just been beautiful in that I love my time at the pool and I don't have to be there as often as I thought I was going to be.
That's so great. So it's like social connections, and even just the idea of knowing that you're going to be doing this is giving you a boost.
It is. It is. It's lovely.
Yeah.
And how about you? You were doing some bells and
Yeah. So I was talking about my music nerd adventure of the past year of joining this handbell choir. And similar to what you're saying, like one of the things that I love about it is it's a group of people. I don't see them in any other context. So, but we all know and see and appreciate each other. We laugh, we just fall over laughing, and we're working through some kind of hard pieces right now. And so there's this combination of like, I know Wednesday night, I'm going to get together with this group of people and we're going to accomplish something together. We're going to get
Mhm.
something done that sounds pretty most of the time. And then it's also, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, it's unexpectedly physical, right?
Yeah,
Like
you
I check
mentioned kind of the
my Fitbit, and according to my Fitbit, I get the equivalent of like 3,000 steps just by releasing some energy, ringing
oh,
bells. So
perfect.
it's really been helpful.
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's switch to talking about this month's selection.
Totally. We got a
So
great book.
excited. So
Mhm.
excited. All right. So it is Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. Ta-da! And, I was joking with you, Sarah, before that like there are a lot of people who have written beautifully about burnout. But for
Mhm.
me, we call this podcast Off the Grind Book Club. We call it OGBC. And this book is one of my OG burnout
Mhm.
books. Even
Totally.
though it's not that old, it was
Mhm.
written, I think it was published in 2019
Mhm.
by Amelia and Emily Nagoski, who
Mhm.
are, as many of you may know, they are actually twin sisters and both very well known in their respective fields. Emily Nagoski is also a world renowned sex educator and has
Mhm.
written some amazing books like Come As You Are. Amelia Nagoski is a choral director, and they came together to write this really useful,
Mhm.
simple, sassy,
Mhm.
uplifting book.
Totally. It's all of those things, but I love the word useful. Mhm.
Yeah, so useful. And so, let's just preface this. First of all, like, where can you get it if you don't have it
Mhm.
or access to them? There are a couple of ways. The book is on Amazon, and I think also on Audible as a audiobook or other places. And then also if you haven't read it and you want to read it, that's a quick way to get it. If you're after our conversation today and you're listening to us talk about it, you're like, that sounds really interesting. I'm not sure I have the bandwidth to totally read a book right now. They are interviewed on several
Mhm.
podcasts. I think they were on Brene Brown's podcast. They were on We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle. And so there are these places where you can hear the two of them get even deeper into the ideas that we're going to talk about today without having to read the whole book. And I also think they have a workbook too, right? Possibly.
Maybe, and I was seeing some TED Talks too, when I
Yes.
was looking at their
So
stuff as
lots
well.
of ways
Mhm.
to find their work, and we really encourage you to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there's another kind of acknowledgement that I think we want to start with too. And it's a big one, and it's a complex one, and really rich. And that is that, it's not actually on the cover, but you don't get but a couple of pages into this book to realize that they are writing about burnout and depletion and systemic issues specifically for women.
Mhm.
Um, and so if you are a woman or identify as female or a woman in any way, that's going to be really intriguing for you. But if you don't, we really think this book is for you also. And here's why. Our conversations are all about depletion in the helping professions.
Mhm.
And helping professions like what? Like mental health professionals, teachers, other education professionals, like nursing,
Mhm.
pastoral folks,
Mhm.
parents. And parenting is its own thing, but all of those things that I just mentioned are all historically female,
Mhm.
right? Even though the demographics are not entirely female now, they were historically done by women. And so, they really talk about givers and helpers, and there's kind of a helper class, which helping professions belong to, that we really have our own set of unique pressures and internalized pressures, externalized pressures. And so, just kind of take that if you don't identify as a woman, take that with you as you read this book. Don't let it dissuade you. Kind of take what you need, leave what you don't, as with
Yep,
anything that we talk about, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, why did we pick this book? What are the things that we find really helpful? Let me start with one,
Yeah.
and then we can jump into it from there. And I think you and I were both really struck by the fact that one of the things they do out of the gate is give a really clear definition for what burnout is,
Mhm. Yep.
right? And it's got these like three E's. There's emotional exhaustion. There's your empathy gets kind of drained. Even though you're an empathic person, it gets drained. Like, I just can't care about this. And your
Mhm.
sense of efficacy goes down. You stop feeling like what you're doing matters. So you're
Mhm.
exhausted. It's harder to care, and you don't feel like you're doing much good anyway.
Yeah.
I just found
Yeah.
that really clear, right?
Yeah, because those are just three things as helpers, right? That we value and are constantly just striving for. And so to have it articulated that clearly, right, it really gives a nice kind of concept of what burnout can look like.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
it does. And, when you said values, it made me think about how all of those things, feeling emotionally energized, feeling like you're making a difference, feeling like you're caring about people, that is so part of the identity of being a helper,
Yeah, that's right.
no matter where you are. And so when we're not feeling those things,
Mhm.
we feel really ineffective,
Mhm.
and it goes against our values, and it's almost a little bit of a moral injury.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. And I think because we value those things so strongly, it leads to the pushing through and I'm just going
Yeah,
to keep going and I just need to try harder and kind of that way we internalize that this must be my deficiency, right? If I'm not able to continue to care to the level that I need to. And so I think that just further perpetuates then the burnout we can feel in this field.
absolutely right. And it's
Mhm.
also systemic, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
think, you
Yeah.
can see it in, reactions to teachers asking for more pay, or reactions to, um, even mental health therapists who we supervise really struggling to just
Mhm.
justify taking time off.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of societal discouragement of
Mm.
helpers from taking care of themselves because their whole identity is to serve.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And I love that you bring in just kind of the systemic piece, which I know we'll talk more about because I think often the antidote to burnout becomes self-care, which caring for yourself in burnout and amidst burnt out systems, right, is a big ask. And it doesn't always acknowledge, right, the systemic barriers that are in place around that.
Absolutely. Yep. Before we move on to our next thing,
Mm-hmm.
we also want to do another, what is it? It's not a disclaimer, it's an invitation, I think. And we're going to keep saying this as in our kind of publicity for this podcast too. We are doing this on YouTube because that's just the platform we're using. Does that mean that you have to sit here and watch us talk? No, no,
No.
we're not that interesting to look at,
No.
really, so please, if you're like, oh, I just don't have time to sit and watch a video, put this on over your headphones at the, in the car, on a walk, at the gym,
Go for a drive.
whatever,
Yeah.
whatever. You're not going to miss anything. We don't do PowerPoints or slides or anything like that. So feel free to
Yes.
turn off the video.
Beautiful.
So what else struck you, Sarah, about this book?
Um, I think uh for me, just that, kind of the initial concept of like separating the things that cause us stress from the actual stress. I think that's such a profound thing. It's simplistic in some ways, but it's very profound. And I think this idea, because I think we can spend a lot of time and energy on changing the things that cause us stress.
Mm,
But like we're acknowledging, I mean, we are talking about systemic barriers, oppression, patriarchy, capitalism, things that are not so easily changed. So it's interesting to me and it feels kind of empowering to think about, okay, this is what causes me stress. But now the stress is in my body and I can be empowered to do something about that. And they give a lot of kind of fun, interesting ways to complete the stress cycle. But really, that idea of just separating those two things, I think, creates a lot of new possibilities for helpers.
So what you're saying is, and I agree that this is a great book to read. Well, it is, full stop, but especially if you're in a situation where you're feeling kind of defeated or overwhelmed or uncertain, like, how am I going to change the public education system where I live? How am I going to change for therapists, like the structure of insurance or whatever? And that you don't have to change those things in order to really start to heal.
Yes.
That
Yes.
reminds me, I'm going to look at my notes to read this quote because
Yeah.
I'm going to get it right.
Please.
They say, you don't have to wait for the world to be better to make your life better. And by making your life better, you make the world better.
Mm.
I just like
Oh, I
that.
love that one. I
And it
love
could
that.
be the world better or your agency. You don't have to make your agency better. You don't have to fix your school. You don't have to fix your
Yes.
hospital that you work at. None of that.
No.
So good.
Yeah. Yeah. But it creates a lot more possibility in our own nervous systems and our own well-being. And yeah, that's really exciting. Yeah.
Moment of hope.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm curious, right? They give us lots of different ways to think about, they talk about completing the stress cycle. And I was like, this is such an interesting concept for me too, because I think for me, sometimes when emotions get started, I'm like, oh no, here they go, and they're just going to keep going. And I remember in some of my own work, especially around grief, kind of having a therapy session where I had an emotion, I tracked it, I felt it, I expressed it, and all of a sudden the emotion kind of was done. And so, they talk about if anger, anxiety, stress, if it starts, it can also complete and stop. And so that's really cool, I think, to think about. And, they give these possibilities around breathing and positive social interactions, laughter, affection. They talk about the big old cry, right? The
Yeah.
catharsis of that, creative expression. They're really finding what works for us. And so I love just kind of this range of ways that they talk about possibilities for completing the stress cycle.
It's such a good point because I think what you're saying and what they're saying, and that we kind of know, is that the stress response in the human body was designed to be completed. It was
Yes.
designed to be completed. It's just something that we do no matter what the stressor is. And it was designed to be completed. And if we don't, if we kind of like, oh, that was stressful. Okay, on to the next thing, it stays there.
Mm-hmm.
It stays there, and then the next one happens, and the next one happens, and I'm kind of even talking about it, I'm feeling like my own memories of times when I just have not attended to that. And like,
Yeah.
why am I so tired all the time?
Yep.
Why am
Yep.
I having these vivid dreams at night? Why am I dreading doing something like teaching, which I know I love to do? And I think it's because of that, right?
Yeah. And I think when the stressors are so kind of chronic and always there and post pandemic social media things like that, it's kind of hard to find the pause to start completing the stress cycle. And yet, right, I think this book gives some good language for how do we start creating time for this? How do we start making this something that we build into our everyday life and something that we're constantly doing to complete kind of smaller stress cycles so that we're not living in such a big one that leads to all this
That's a
depletion.
really good point. I don't know. I think that we have this culture in this country, in the US, of in popular media of grand transformation. Like,
Mhm.
like eliminate your stress in 30 days and all of a sudden start doing all of these things. Like that's so overwhelming, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's
Mhm.
about health or diet culture or whatever, but I think it's also really related to self-care.
Mhm.
And that, those little practices, daily, weekly, whatever, and they can be really small. That's what I love about how the Nagoskis talk about this. They can be really small and very impactful.
And it's all within us, right? It's not, we don't need to go purchase this thing to feel better. We don't need to kind of do this big thing. Like the options that they're talking about are things that are within us and within our control most of the time on a daily basis to think about, oh, I do have this ability to help my body move the stress.
That's right. So maybe we should talk about what they recommend
Mhm.
as far as these starting with some of these small practices. So they talk
Mhm.
about um, physical activity.
Yeah. Mhm.
And, this is definitely your wheelhouse, Sarah, as an athlete and
Yeah.
like practitioner like I am. So,
Yeah.
what did you make of the whole active, like the activity, physical activity, where they weren't really talking about working out?
Nope, nope, nope. Yeah, and so one of my favorite concepts from this book that I think kind of relates to just moving and having some capacity to like do some different things, right? Because they're talking about it's not an intellectual thing that we're going to work our way out of, right? But it's kind of like, what can we start to do? And this concept of active rest.
Mm,
Okay, and I'm going to look at my notes here because they have a
yeah.
great definition. Okay, so it's this idea of like working one gear while you're resting others, which is so profound for me because I think this idea of, it can be really confusing in our body when we start to be burnt out and experience depletion because I think what it feels like is we want sleep and we want rest.
Right.
But I know for me, in times of burnout, I'll come home, I'll sleep through the evening, right? I miss time with my family and connections and doing more to help myself be ready, and then all of a sudden it's the next morning again. So this concept of active rest, of like doing something while we rest something, they kind of talked about while they were writing this book that had like some research content. One of them I think was also writing a novel, right, which was a hugely different kind of writing, which that
Writing a
featured
novel
in
as
the book.
self-care is not
Yes,
my bingo card, but I'm glad it's on theirs.
it is, right? I know how beautiful that they can use their mind in both ways. So for me, it's interesting. One of the gifts that the COVID pandemic gave me was some time to learn crochet. And
Oh, yeah.
so I think for me, right, even when beautiful therapy work is happening, it can be slow and deep. And so sometimes it can be really hard to measure progress. But when I crochet at night, I can keep myself a little bit more present around my family. I can crochet a line on my blanket and I see progress. And that feels like active rest to me, right? Because I think I'm like getting to see and work this like active, exciting place of progress that feels really cool and is kind of interesting in, kind of that feeling effective. Did my work matter today? Oh, I just crocheted a row and I can see it and it feels really good to see some progress there.
That's so good. So like when I'm at handbells, then,
Mhm.
I am, first of all, very much not at work. I am
Mhm.
work is set at the outside the door. Nobody
Mhm.
knows me in that way anyway. They know what I do for a living, but we don't talk about what we do for a living. And then we are finding ways to feel effective by working through this piece. So that targets that decreased sense of efficacy that's part of burnout.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Which
then
is
the,
beautiful, like synchronization too,
yeah,
that where just the feeling of like being with others in this music making process and kind of coming into that.
that being with others makes me think about, so the a second thing that's part of burnout, according to them, is this loss of empathy, which sounds dramatic. It's not usually total loss of empathy. It's more just I can't extend, I can't give
Mm-hmm.
anymore, right?
Yeah.
And then I love how they talk about, okay, what do we do about that? What are the small practices we can do? Some of it is about actually physical touch. If you, with a partner, friend, pet, like
Mm-hmm.
getting that oxytocin released. But then they also have this great concept of, I don't remember if they call it this or I am just calling this in my brain because I love it, the bubble of love. And
Ah,
the bubble of love is finding and cultivating relationships of, I'm going to look at my notes,
yeah.
co-regulation and curiosity.
Mm.
So hanging with people who might be at your workplace or they might help you process through stuff from work, like in a helpful way, or not, like finding, really meaningful social connection.
Mm.
And that it may not seem like it fixes, again, it's like what you were saying, right? That does
Yeah.
not fix the stressor,
Yep.
but it really heals that part of the burnout to be
Mm-hmm.
in a relationship where you are being seen, where you
Mm-hmm.
are being cared for in any way, a book club, a
Mm-hmm.
neighbor you go for a walk with, whatever it is, no matter, even if you don't talk about the issues at hand.
Yes, that's right. That's
And
right.
that's so hard in helping professions because most of us kind of go on our second shift when we walk through the door at night,
Mm-hmm.
right? We also are working at home in our family relationships
Mm-hmm.
and at our workplaces. And, you and I come from the mental health field, but we also are educators. And,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of relationships are seen as extra.
Yeah.
They're not
Mm-hmm.
billable. They're not, there's
Mm-hmm.
kind of fluffy and, they take away from work time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, right? We're trying to like sneak in a little social contact here and there, but yet to really like have time to be with people and to kind of hold people in this work. And yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to think about it, and yet it can be a real challenge.
It's total challenge. I mean, just think about, you know, what would happen of like, talk about water. What about if every water cooler had a
Hmm.
sign that said burnout healing station?
Oh,
Wouldn't that be
I
amazing?
love it. I love it. Yes.
So it's not something you kind of sneak away and do. It's like, no, I'm going to do this so that I can come back to my work more centered and filled up.
Yes. And to know that your workplace culture is encouraging that, right? Like,
Encouraging it. That's
yes,
right.
yes. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I think I don't know within that love bubble, right? They've got some great solutions of a 6-second kiss and a 20-second hug, and right, just kind of these concrete ways of like this much affection helps us to come into that like neuroception of relatively safety, and I'm with my people, and now I can start to kind of discharge some of that stress.
That's right. That's
Mhm.
right. Um, and then the thing about feeling effective too, and I think you were kind of talking about this with like your crocheting and whatever, but they apply it to your actual work, the
Mhm.
stressors
Mhm.
themselves, is how to look at formulating your goals. Like, what
Mhm.
does it mean to
Yeah.
feel effective if this
Mm.
is the circumstance that you're working in? Because we need to feel effective. And they're not saying it to minimize
Mm.
the stressors or to be over accommodating and like, oh, well, like nobody wants to be a martyr,
Yep. Yep.
but to really formulate. And then I think they just lay out also very clearly in terms of feeling effective, feeling depleted, some bigger systemic issues. This book is
Mhm.
really very macro in that way, as well as micro, in giving us
Yeah,
those practices. So
yeah.
systemic issues, like we kind of talked about it, like the systemic, in the worst case scenario, it's systemic gaslighting. Like, why are you, if you're tired, that's your problem. You're not effective, you're selfish, you're whatever, discouraging of self-care because it's not productive, which is
Mhm.
what helpers are supposed to be and what a capitalist society is supposed to be too.
Exactly.
Um, and also they talk about, the impact of helpers, or they're talking about women specifically, but all helpers who come from other marginalized historically communities,
Mhm.
So if I am a teacher, that is stressful, full stop. If I'm a teacher of color, I
Mhm.
am perhaps carrying around in my lived experience, in my community's lived experience, a whole other layer of stress, which is just not respected or talked about very well. Maybe more, a little bit more now, but boy, we have a long way to go.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yep. And I think that's one thing that this book gives a lot of freedom around, right? We're all going to have different things that are stressing our nervous system, and to be able to kind of hold that and be with that as we work through completing the stress cycle. But also, too, like as you're talking, Mari, about just different systemic pressures, one thing I love is that this book gives us some ways to think about like our effort to progress ratio. And it gives us a way to think about saying no and how do we want to care for some of these things when the discomfort of doing them puts us in a place where it really is maintaining this chronic stress. And so I really love that this book gives us ways to think through, how do I reframe some of this stuff? How do I know when I'm ready to step out of this stressor? And to really think through that piece of things.
That's a really good point. And also, we should say, I mean, like I said, I think there's a workbook now, but also the actual book is full of like worksheets,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
things to help. I know when I'm feeling depleted, I'm like, just somebody tell me how to make this
Mm-hmm.
decision. Somebody tell me how to set this boundary. And they're like,
Totally.
yep, here we go. So they
Mhm.
have wonderful, simple how-tos and graphics just to help people feel empowered. And
Yeah.
that's like, I guess one of the last things I want us to bring out is they talk about the importance of for healing burnout, to heal that emotional exhaustion, connecting to, they call it something larger,
Yes.
meaning
Yeah.
making.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love is they start by acknowledging that, yes, for many people, that may be some kind of spirituality, like a bigger sense of meaning in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It may be a sense of kind of, you and I call it mission energy, like this is why I'm here, this is what I'm doing, but then they kind of turn it a little bit and they say, well, guess what? Actually, the something larger, that meaning, the purpose is something that is actually inside you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
connecting to that for yourself outside of and including your job.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they really talk about how to do that, but that is transformative.
Yes. 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 Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, right? When we're talking about the impacts of working in, big insurance systems or education or hospitals, right? Larger systems. I think that can be confusing to our meaning making, right? Because maybe sometimes our values and meaning that we give to our work and the systemic pressures are very real and very different. And so, right, to be able to ground ourselves and to really hold inside of us that meaning making for the work that we do, or just the way we are in the world, right? It doesn't have to be limited to our work, but it opens up a lot of new possibilities as well.
That's right. And those tools are really helpful for thinking about. I mean, we're recording this during challenging times
Mm-hmm.
to be in the world with a lot of big stressors that we definitely can't do anything about.
Mm-hmm.
So these principles are really helpful for that too, I think.
Yep, yep, that's right. That's right. And I think they're so good in this book about really encouraging, like, find what works for you, right? Like, I think in some ways too, we don't want to keep talking about like our own responsibility for our self-care. We want it built into our systems as well. But this idea of like, take some freedom and find what works for you. Think about how you build it into the way you move through the world. Like, what do you need around that? How can you create space for this? Because I think they really acknowledge like the impact of the stress. Like it takes time, it takes energy to move that stress through. And when, they actually give some concrete numbers about how much time every day you need to do that. And it's pretty profound to think about, yeah, like this is something we often neglect because of the busyness of our world. And yet it's pretty profound what we need to be able to do to move this stress through.
Totally. And yeah, that's exactly right. And so they're really, the message here is number one, if you're feeling depleted or burned out, there is hope.
Hmm.
Number two, it is not your fault.
Yes, that's
It is
right.
not because you aren't working at it. It is
Mhm.
just not on us. It is not our fault.
Mhm.
And number three, it's about, finding like kind of just shifting that lens from like bailing water out of the boat and self-care and oh my gosh, I gotta add that to my list to no,
Mhm.
we're actually entitled
Yes.
to heal and
Yeah.
thrive as helpers,
Mm.
which is the
Oh
whole
gosh,
reason we're
Meredith,
having
as
these
you say that.
conversations, right? It's
Yeah,
like we are
yeah.
entitled to thrive. And how do we do that given kind of the messed up systemic stuff that we're plunked down in the middle of?
Yes, yes. Ooh, I love that possibility of like thriving in this and finding some new ways to kind of allow the stress cycle to complete, right? I think that's what this is about. And so you're right. I think those messages that they give in this book to make this something larger than us as individuals and keep thinking about, like you said earlier, right? As we take care of ourselves, community care, self care go hand in hand, and just kind of the beauty that we can kind of create as we all care for ourselves and each other.
Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you think? Should we kind of move into thinking
Yeah,
about what we're going to take from this?
yeah,
What do you
yeah.
think?
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should. It's been really fun. I mean, because this is an interesting book to sort of read and reread and reference and come back to. And so it's really, again, usable in that sense. So, yeah. Do you have any initial thoughts on that?
Well, I find myself thinking because, like you, this is a book I have come back to more than once, and every time I'm kind of re-inspired
Mm-hmm.
to think um, about these frameworks for myself. I'm re-inspired thinking about how simple it is, how accessible it is,
Mm-hmm.
how immediately you can put it into practice. This is not like some dense theoretical book. It's like we're here to help. Also, they're hilarious and
Yes. Yes,
fun, playful, which we're big fans of.
we are.
Yeah. But then, thinking about getting reinvigorated with my own micro little practices like they're talking about.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Those micro practices. I love that word too, right? Like self care isn't this
Yeah,
big thing. It's these little things that we infuse into our day.
that's
Mhm.
right.
Yeah. Does
Right.
that bring any specific things for you over the next month?
That's a really good question. Yeah. So we are recording this in April, which is mid-April. So we're getting close to spring. And I think for myself, a good reminder to, connect with larger meaning also means for me, like sitting underneath some trees.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
sitting on my deck with my cup of coffee and just kind of having that be active rest, appreciating being out there. That's something that I want to work in.
Yep. Beautiful.
How about you?
Yeah, I've kind of been thinking about that too. I keep, without the snow, not that we've had a lot of snow, but just with everything kind of being clear and starting to get green, I can start to think a little bit about gardening. And
Oh,
so for me, like I'm not a real like sit person, but so gardening is kind of this way that I can move slowly. I can grow food to feed people, so it brings in my sense of community. So I sort of just keep thinking about what do I want to plant in my garden this year? How do I
wow.
want to prep that? How do I want to be out in my yard with my garden? And so and it's just really this nice thing after a work day to come home to. I can take a walk outside and just spend a little time pulling weeds, picking vegetables. And so yeah, I'm just
It's really
noticing.
tangible too.
Yeah.
And aren't we a great example of like, you know, not that we're all one thing, but like what works for me to feel
Mhm.
restful is to be still sometimes. What works for you to feel restful is to be a little more productive, but not with work,
Right.
right?
That's
And
right.
that's exactly what they're talking about is that you find what works for you. So
Mhm.
we wanted to try something, an invitation too, just kind of as we close,
Yeah.
is once we, you are done listening to this, to kind of maybe if you want to post a comment
Mhm.
underneath to say, what is something that is a micro practice for you that you are either doing that is really
Mhm.
helpful or that you might do? And that could
Yeah.
be around, that love bubble of a relationship. It might be a way to feel productive. It might be a way, some other ways of finding active rest, whatever it might be. We would love to hear and then get inspired by each other too.
That's the big thing, right? Let's inspire each other and kind of steal each other's good ideas, right? Because it's so fun to hear how others care for themselves. And like you said, we all like to do it differently, but sometimes you just hear somebody kind of care for themselves in a way that you're like, oh, that really speaks to me. And I would love to, just
Yeah,
experiment with it a little bit.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, good. We'd love to hear
Good.
from you in the comment section.
Yep.
We appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'll say goodbye until next time.
Yes. Be well, everyone.
Bye.